Hello, my name is Anthony Piccarello, and I'm the Executive Director of the St. John Paul II National Shrine here in Washington, D.C. I'm privileged today to be joined by Professor D.C. Schindler of the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family Studies, where he is the Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology. Welcome, Professor Schindler.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
On September 14th, 1981, Pope John Paul II issued his third encyclical, Laborem Exercens. The title translates through work and focuses on the meaning of human labor. The encyclical is the first in what would become a set of three that John Paul II would issue in further development of Catholic social doctrine, which traces its origins back to 1891, the encyclical of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. And in fact, Laborem Exercens was meant to mark the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, but that anniversary was May 15th of 1981, which turned out to be 2 days after the attempt on John Paul II's life, and so it was delayed for about 5 months. So here at the Shrine, we're marking the anniversary of this great document, Laborem Exercens, as well as Labor Day, which is just a few days behind, by this conversation with Professor Schindler. So once again, thanks for coming.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. So if you could begin with just kind of a quick summary of the document. What's the gist? What was John Paul II trying to get across, sort of for the average Catholic?
Sure. Yeah, in fact, I think it's unlike some of the other encyclicals, it's fairly easy to get right to the heart of this one. I mean, I think you can probably summarize the essence of the encyclical's teaching in just one phrase. John Paul II wanted to bring out the meaning of work essentially as an intrinsic human good. And the whole document is summed up, I think, in that phrase. And the two parts of the phrase are really crucial. So it's an intrinsic good. Work is an intrinsic good, meaning it's not simply an instrumental good. It's not simply something, a means by which we make stuff and we make money, but there's something about the very activity of work that is good for man. And then the second part is that it's human. It's a human good. John Paul II points out that that work is a distinctively human activity, that only human beings work, he says. Right. So it distinguishes us from subhuman creatures, but also in a way from angels, because it's embodied spirit that works. And one of the things that's interesting about the document, and it helps you get a sense of the whole of it, is as you mentioned a moment ago, it's one of the updating sort of commentaries on Rerum Novarum, the Catholic social teaching, and this is the only encyclical written specifically on work, even though work has always sort of features in a special way. It's the focus of this document, and he explains why he does that. On the one hand, signals this point that's often made that work is really the heart of Catholic social teaching. That might be something we talk about.
Sure.
But the second reason is that he saw it as a kind of an increasingly urgent question given historical circumstances.
Sure.
And he thought that the church had something distinctive to say, that the church brought a perspective that you wouldn't get simply, you might say, from the world. And that shows up then in the structure of the document. So he begins with situating work in the context of Genesis, which he calls the first gospel of work. It's a part of the plan of creation. Work is a blessing that God gives to man, that of course gets distorted because of original sin and becomes toilsome in ways that was not part of the original meaning of work. But then at the end of the document, he comes back to the theological perspective and offers a spirituality of work. And here we see that even the toilsome aspect of work can be part of the blessing. So he interprets this as an opportunity to participate in a small way in the suffering, the work of redemption, the suffering of the cross. So the Genesis and you might say the Old Testament and New Testament are sort of the framing for the central discussion, where he gets into a number of more practical
Yeah.
matters, the relationship between labor and capital.
Sure.
But I would say maybe the theme that really summarizes the central part, where he talks about the practical matters, is this refrain really that comes up over and over, which is that work is for man, not man for
Right.
work. That
Right.
we need to recall the central significance of the human person
Sure.
when we engage these various questions about
Sure,
work.
and
So that's
and that's a theme that we see elsewhere in terms of people over things.
right.
I mean, even here, priority of labor over capital. You know, that kind
That's
of. They are all sort of.
Part of that.
Yeah, exactly.
theme.
Sort of in
Yeah.
the same mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Could you? I'd like to circle back on some of those points that you introduced. I mean, this idea that this document, part of what makes it distinctive in this run of Catholic social encyclicals, is its focus on. I mean, maybe it may be unique precisely in having such a narrow focus to begin with.
Right. Interesting.
But then also that it focuses on work and at the same time describes work as sort of the central question to the social question, right? It's essential key, very center.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit for us, if you would.
Sure. No, that's it's interesting. So work is mentioned even in Rerum Novarum.
Sure.
Leo XIII pointed to work as a key question, even though it's not the center of that particular document. And interestingly enough, Ratzinger, prior to being Pope Benedict, in a commentary that he wrote on Vatican II, in discussing Gaudium et Spes, which is the document about the Church's relationship to the world, he mentions it's an offhand comment, but he says that work is the center of that document. Now, what's so strange is that work is not a major theme. He understood that theoretically somehow, if you're going to talk about the Church's relationship to the world, somehow the question of work lies right at the center of that. And I think that's part of the inspiration for John Paul II as well. He sees that there are an extraordinary number of notions, ideas, problems, concerns, themes that converge in the question of work. You have man's relationship to nature.
Right.
You have the relationship between body and soul. When man works, he enters into relationship with others in a very fundamental way. So you have, economic questions, political questions, the meaning of our existence on earth. You have questions in terms of theology regarding the states of life, mission, what the purpose of the church in relation to the world. All these things really converge in this question of work in a way that I think few people saw as clearly as John Paul II. And so it made a lot of sense for him to focus this encyclical on that question.
Great. And the other distinctive, it seems, and again, this is maybe common to the other social encyclicals, is focus on the sign of the times, you might say, right? So these encyclicals tend to fall on sort of 10th year anniversaries, and so they're kind of looking at their particular historical circumstances and taking those same sort of venerable principles and applying them anew to whatever's up right then.
That's right.
So what was it that was on John Paul II's mind in 1981 as it relates to this world of work and Catholic social doctrine and so forth?
Yeah. So it's interesting, just that fact. I mean, you don't have encyclicals that are updating the doctrine of the incarnation or the Trinity, right? These are these are timeless. But it's interesting that the social teaching always needs to be updated.
Yes.
Not because the church is getting things wrong and needs to rethink, but because the world changes.
Exactly.
And so in a prudential fashion, we have to respond to the new concerns. And if you think about the early '80s, I mean, that was the time of the Cold War was really kind of at a pitch. Obviously, the question of communism was a burning one for John Paul II, and not only not only in Poland in the world, but you have there, this battle between capitalism and communism, you might say, and both of them represent a certain kind of materialism.
Right.
The church has probably been clearer in the criticism of communism, but it's not simply the case that the church takes the side of capitalism, and that becomes evident in this document. That,
Yes.
The Pope points out that there are kinds of materialists heresies, tendencies also from the West. So I think that's the general background, but very specifically, he mentions in the encyclical itself, he gives three distinct reasons that this question is important now. One, he says there have been developments in technology that are threatening to displace man as a worker, with
Jobs being
automation,
automated, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so automation. So that's one question that calls into question human work. Secondly, that he raises, interestingly, the ecological question and natural resources, both in terms of the damage that we can potentially do to the planet, but also, I don't know if you recall back then, the phrase peak oil was one that you heard a bit around then. This concern that we were going to run out of oil and run out of natural resources, deplete the planet, and then what? So that was starting to bubble to the surface. No pun intended.
Yeah.
And then third, the fact that he said, that this sort of globalized economy was becoming a real thing. So developing countries that had been sort of left out of the game, you might say, on the world scale, were entering into it. And then that was raising all of these new questions about, farming out work to finding cheaper resources for work, than creating crises of unemployment, and then things like immigration and so forth. All of those. So those were the three in particular that he was addressing.
Great. Excellent. So we've been talking about this in terms of its location within the Catholic social encyclicals, again, tracing back to Rerum Novarum. But in a way, this document represents maybe a relatively early development of another key strand in his thought about Christian anthropology, and focusing on the nature of the human person, and especially what it is that Jesus reveals to us about our human nature and our relationship to God. Obviously, the Redemptor Hominis, the very first encyclical, is utterly foundational in that regard. This is only his third. There's been one in between, but it's sort of an early development, and there are ways in which it fits in that strand as well. So if you could reflect on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, he makes that point explicitly. Yeah. He points to Redemptor Hominis, the claim that he makes there that man is the principal way for the church.
Yep.
That the church's engagement with the world, with reality, with creation, passes through man, and so this task to understand human existence is central to the church's mission, theological and you might say worldly mission. And there's really no one, I think, among the popes and theologians perhaps who saw that as clearly as John Paul II.
Sure.
And what I find so interesting is he. One of the things we know, popularly about him, what's distinctive about his theological vision, he's the theologian of marriage. That's one of the main things that we think of him. There have been some that say that in the long run, I don't know if I would support this claim.
Sure.
But I've read this claim that in the long run he will be better known as the theologian of work, even more than marriage. I don't know that that's true, but I think it's interesting that these two themes are so central to him.
Sure.
So much so, it's there's a substantial history of work written by a secular author. He's not certainly not Catholic, and I don't think he's Christian. But when he points to the two most important figures of the 20th century writing on work, it's Hannah Arendt and John Paul II.
Wow,
which is extraordinary.
It is.
Now, why the reason I mention it in relation to marriage, if you look at Genesis, when man is created, the two commandments in the calling to love that are inscribed in his being are the commandment to be fruitful, multiply, so marriage and family,
Yes.
and the commandment to till the field, to
Right.
subdue the earth, and work.
Right.
Yeah. And so marriage and work really are the defining dimensions of human existence. And I think John Paul II saw that with an extraordinary clarity and depth, and made those themes central to his theological vision. And that's, comes out so clearly in this encyclical.
That's for sure. Well, great. So again, we've been sort of dealing with it at so far at the sort of thematic level, and sort of locating it within these different strands of thought, broader strands of thought. But as you mentioned earlier, the document eventually kind of gets into the nitty-gritty. Yeah, it really does, and talks about things like wages and benefits and time off and unions and all the kind of the nuts and bolts about work life. And that's also a remarkable move. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, and that's in a way the emergence of Catholic social thought was a surprise, because these seem to be not matters that would concern the church.
Right.
And Leo XIII, I think it was groundbreaking precisely because he made that clear, that the church is concerned with all of reality, and these dimensions are central to it. But it's interesting. John Paul II mentions in the encyclical, though Catholic social thought begins with Rerum Novarum in an explicit way, it was there from the beginning in Genesis and New Testament. Now, one of the things I find most fascinating and maybe most provocative, especially in the modern context, because the questions are all so relevant still.
Sure.
Two themes that stand out to me. One is his mention of a family wage.
Yeah.
That used to be a thematic part of Catholic social thought, but you don't hear much talk about it anymore. And it's hard to make sense of it unless you recall the central teaching, which is that work is for man, not man for work.
Right.
And the family wage is simply this idea that a just wage needs to take into consideration what a human being needs to live in a human way, and a human way means as part of a family. One should be able to work in a way that provides for a family, so that, as he makes explicit in this document, that the mother doesn't have to work in order to support, contribute to the support. So that, and so much of the modern context, work is that the economy just presupposes a dual income family, and John Paul II is aware of what damage that does to human existence. I think it's something that we're becoming increasingly aware of now. And one solution to that is to recall this family wage that people should be paid in a way that allows them to live in this way. So that's one theme I find really intriguing.
Sure.
The second one that I mentioned, and he gets into many more than just these, but this question of unemployment that is raised with technology, question of automation that's intensified now with AI, of course, and then also the global scene and immigration and so forth. This idea of people losing jobs. He insists that when we face this question of unemployment, we recall the meaning of work. Work isn't simply about producing stuff.
Yes.
It's about, in the first place, living a meaningful human existence. And that work is essential to that. So that even if we had the technological means to make everything we needed without work, that wouldn't be something from a Catholic perspective that we would want to pursue. That actually would turn out to be a hellish existence. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a novel, The Player Piano, that sort of spells out what that would look like in this really dystopian universe. And it's a compelling vision. It's very different. The question is a very different one if we think about work as meaningful and not just useful.
So that's interesting. So the problem of unemployment there is a problem of potentially production without work. In other words,
Yeah.
and as much as the work is automated, that's why you have the unemployment.
Yeah.
He also he used very strong language about unemployment. I noticed, like
Yeah.
he just straight up calls it evil. I was
Yeah.
like, wow, that's
Yeah.
kind of bracing.
Yeah, that's
Very
right.
powerful stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. But it makes sense if
Sure.
if you know the calling to love built into man is one dimension, essential dimension of it is
Right.
work.
Right.
Then to remove work is to destroy some fundamental
Right.
dimension of human existence.
And the capacity for subsistence in most cases.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
That's right.
it's profound stuff. As we've been reflecting on each of these encyclicals, I'm finding that they are evergreen and prophetic. They basically continue to have relevance even to a new set of circumstances. And I think this encyclical, I think, is no exception, because I think that there seems to be these days in 2024 a lot of reflection, new reflection, intense reflection on the role of work in our lives, particularly post-pandemic, I think.
Yeah.
When you think about work from home and hybrid work and sort of work-life balance questions, the universal basic income idea that's kicking around, which sort of runs this idea of output without work.
Yeah, that's right.
Different changing attitudes towards unions, changing attitudes towards college as a preparation for a career as opposed to, say, a trade school as preparation for a career. So I was thinking about these kind of current developments a bit while reflecting on the document. I'd be interested in your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I think you're absolutely right. That their principles are established in this encyclical without a presumption to solve problems that are always going to be changing. And not only do they change with the times, but they're very different in every particular country. And so to try to resolve questions universally could create all sorts of problems. So it's up to those who receive the teaching in the particular places at particular times to rethink some of these things. As you say, every dimension that we've mentioned has to be rethought. But we need to do it, as the encyclical reminds us, from the perspective, from the heart of the matter, which is that work is in the first place a blessing, not a curse, a necessary blessing. And that when we think about what the proper way to organize work and to pay for it and to make it possible, all of that has to be done on the basis of this fundamental truth of the human being. So just to take one example, this sort of this universal salary idea.
Universal basic income.
Basic income idea, rather. Salary is not the right word, actually, to use that. Universal basic income. I mean, what's interesting is that might sound a little bit like the family wage that I just mentioned, this idea that you detach, you don't simply pay people according to how much they produce, which would be an instrumentalizing of work, but you pay people in a way that does justice to who they are. That might sound something like this universal basic income that wants to free the human beings and therefore affirm their dignity in relation to the more material aspects of work. But it's profoundly different, and I think in an important way. The universal basic income detaches payment simply from work, and that's not at all what the church envisions. That this earning a living really does have to pass through activity, at least in principle. Now, the other extreme is to reduce it simply to what you produce. It's not that, but it's also not this complete separation. So there's a recognition that part of the dignity of the human being is our capacity to work. And anything that would threaten that has to be reconsidered in light of these basic truths.
And it underscores how we are, in a sense, hardwired to do this work, right? So again, it sort of runs back to the anthropological question. What is the nature of the human person? There are many facets. One of them is this aspect of work. It's kind of, as you say, only humans work, but then also It's part of what defines us.
Yeah, and I think we all experience that.
Right.
There is something, a kind of satisfaction that one feels
Sure.
at the end of a day of good hard work.
Right.
That it's hard to, you really can't compare it to anything else.
That's right.
And as intimidating as some of the challenges may be, and as much of as there's inevitably some suffering that we might want to avoid, I think at the end of the day, we wouldn't exchange that for anything. It seems to me.
Yes.
Or we would be tempted to,
right?
But we know that in the long run we would regret it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the moment, you always want to break, right?
Yeah,
but
that's right.
It's good that it's a vacation rather than kind of a termination.
Well, it's interesting. There have actually been some studies done, psychological experiments,
sure,
on people in waiting rooms. And some of them just had to wait doing absolutely nothing. And some were given really difficult math problems to work on. And they asked the people which they would prefer, and nobody would prefer to do the math problems.
Right.
If you asked them ahead of time. But at the end of the time, the ones who worked on the math problems were the ones who reported actually enjoying the time better, and finding it go more quickly.
Right,
and so
less frustrating.
It's less frustrating, yeah. And whereas it was pure suffering in the end.
Right.
And, that's it. That's the human condition. We're
Right.
tempted to take the easy way out, but in fact, it turns out that it's a much more meaningful life that's engaged with reality.
Sure.
For all the challenges it poses.
Excellent. So we're reflecting a little bit on the universal basic income question. Again,
Mm-hmm.
there's also this question about appropriate preparation for a career, for
Mm-hmm.
work life. Again, in our society for a long time, it's been sort of unquestioned. College is the best way. If you can do it, you should do it. And that's the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And trade school is kind of there in the background. That's being reconsidered. It seems like the current conversation just, again, I'm not even thinking in Catholic circles, just sort of ambiently in the culture.
Right.
This seems like a live issue. And it seems like, again, John Paul II in this document manifests it, but elsewhere you see, obviously, enormously scholarly professor by trade, you might say, but enormous respect at the same time for those who work with their hands.
Yeah.
So again, that's just another thing in our current circumstance that invited some reflection.
Yeah, I mean, he spent time, in a quarry,
Right.
Which was very hard work in a
Sure.
way. It's sort of a paradigm of laborious manual labor.
The proverbial salt mines, right?
And yeah, exactly. and he actually loved it in a way. Looking back on it, it's extraordinary to see. Back when I was in high school, a trade school was just a sign of failure.
Right.
But increasingly, it's the wise and the independent and the free that are starting to look at that as an alternative to college. So you have this very well-known, well-received book by Matthew Crawford, Shop Class is Soul Craft, that I think was at the part of the beginning of this rediscovery of the significance of the trades. But there have been new schools so that are deepening the sense of the dignity of manual labor and training for manual labor,
Yes.
not as an alternative to college, but as part of the college experience. So
Interesting. It's sort of integrated with it.
That's right. So they're new. They're and I'm involved with one that has just begun in Steubenville, Ohio, the
neat.
College of St. Joseph the Worker, that wants to recover, on the one hand, a sense of the guild. So one learns to be a carpenter or electrician, or a mason, or plumbing. So
Sure.
you learn HVAC. You learn these
Right.
sort of trades in the context of a liberal education.
Wow.
So also reading the great books and so forth. And this isn't the only place that's being done. That these are starting to pop up here and there. But I think it's exciting, and it's a sign of the times. And one might look at it, I think, as a kind of a fruit
Sure.
of this encyclical,
Sure.
a distant fruit many decades later.
Yeah. And it's remarkable also how it sort of bridges those two worlds, right? In
Yeah.
other words, it's not one or the other,
Yeah.
but there's an integration there.
Yeah, and it's not an accident that it's Catholics who are at the
Sure.
forefront of that. I think that's an interesting point.
And a wonderful patron with St. Joseph.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Well, thank you for this time. Thank you for the conversation. If you'd like, I'd appreciate if you could conclude us with a prayer.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Yes, in the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I think it's appropriate to ask for the intercession of precisely St. Joseph. So St. Joseph, who worked to support the Holy Family and who taught his son, his foster son, the meaning of work, we ask for your intercession and guidance to teach us to appreciate good work and to undertake the work that is given to us in a spirit of service and love. So for your intercession and that of your blessed spouse, in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks.